we're in a unique moment of cinematic history for kaiju and Godzilla as a whole, in that the last Japanese Godzilla film, Godzilla Minus One, was released in December of 2023. And currently in theaters, we have the latest American Godzilla film, Godzilla Kong, The New Empire, which was released in March of 2024. This is the only time in Godzilla's history where a Japanese and American Godzilla film have been released in less than a year, or in this case, less than 6 months from each other. So we thought this was a poignant moment to compare and contrast these films. So I think it brings a good way to see how do the Japanese handle Godzilla, how do the Americans handle Godzilla, and what does that mean for what it's providing the audience? I think the first thing to start is like what really constitutes a great Godzilla film and what constitutes a great kaiju film as a whole. So when we talk about the best Godzilla films ever made, whether we're talking about American, Japanese, doesn't matter, or great kaiju films, like you could even include King Kong films in there, what really makes those best ones stand out are a few qualities. So number one, you have to have good monster action. Like, ain't nobody coming to see a kaiju film without seeing some kaiju. So we need to have some good monster action. That means good design of the monsters, good fights, and good reasons for them to fight as well. We also need to have a strong human plot, which a lot of people listening may scratch their heads and be like, well, aren't the humans just there to fill in space? Not in the best movies. The secret sauce for the best kaiju movies and best Godzilla movies is actually to have such a strong human plot that you could actually take Godzilla out of the film and you would still be left with a great movie by itself. And the reason that is a lot of people, when they talk about bad Godzilla movies or bad kaiju films, are always like, we just need to get through the human filler to get to the monster fights. And if you ever hear someone say that, that's a clear sign it's a bad kaiju movie. Because the human plot should be so good and so invigorating that you are equally satisfied going between kaiju and human easily, because that's what's going to keep you engaged. And truly the best movies will integrate the kaiju and human plot lines, so they're not just happening parallel, they're constantly intersecting with each other, not at the same time. So those are the main qualities we're looking for the best Godzilla films and the best kaiju films as a whole. So that sets the stage then for how do we compare and contrast Godzilla Minus One, last Toho Japanese Godzilla film, and Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire, the last American and current MonsterVerse film. So if we start with the openings of Godzilla Minus One, you have a main character who is at the end of World War II and is a kamikaze pilot who basically does not want to be a kamikaze pilot. He feels Japan's losing the war, doesn't want to give up his life. He lands on a remote refueling station to get his plane looked at. While he's there, Godzillasaurus shows up and basically kills everyone except for him and one other person on the island. And the other person on the island blames him for the deaths because he did not use the guns on his plane to fight this Godzillasaurus. He then goes back to the outskirts of Tokyo, where he's from, to find his family is dead. Almost everyone he knows is dead, minus a few people. And he's basically trying to rebuild his life. And that kind of sets the premise of that film. By contrast, for Godzilla Kong, New Empire, we have Godzilla and Kong who have recently fought in a previous film. Godzilla is on the surface world, keeping the other Titans in check. King Kong is exploring the Hollow Earth, which was more recently explored in the previous Godzilla vs. Kong film. Godzilla is fighting a bunch of Titans and keeping them in place at the very beginning. Kong is just trying to survive and explore Hollow Earth more. A seismic event happens because Kong is protecting himself from a pack of hyena dogs that unleashes a new threat. And that kind of sets the stage for Godzilla, Kong, A New Empire. So two films that are starting at very different points. One is at an origin point where Godzilla does not exist yet. He's a Godzillasaurus. And this other one, Godzilla, is well established. This is the fifth installment in the MonsterVerse film. So you have an established Godzilla and an established continuity trying to move forward with the plot. So we're starting these films in a very different place. The things that we talked about that make a film good doesn't matter whether you're doing an origin story or whether you're doing a continuity moving forward, they're still going to apply for us in the end. And I think what's very telling at the beginning of these two movies is both at the start of both of these films, you have a lot of monster action. Godzilla -1, you have a Godzillasaurus show up, kill a bunch of people. You don't have to wait that long for him to show up. And Godzilla, Kong, A New Empire, you start with Kong, you transition to Godzilla very quickly as well. So you're getting that monster action. And I think one of the key differences is the amount of time and the amount of characterization we get on the humans at the beginning part of this film. So the main character in Godzilla -1, we get a lot of background on him being a kamikaze pilot. We see the devastation of Tokyo at the end of World War II. We see the shame that the citizens bring upon him because he's a kamikaze pilot who's still alive, which means he didn't perform his kamikaze duties. And he's also trying to deal with a orphan child and a woman who's trying to take care of this orphan child who is not her child, but she basically said she's going to help take care of this kid because the parents were killed along with the main male character's parents in the bombings of Tokyo during World War II. So we already have this kind of core family being built, and a lot of time is being talked about what's happening in Japan at the time, what's happening in the world at the time, setting that stage. By contrast, we have some reoccurring characters, Dr. Andrew, an anthropologist from the previous film Godzilla vs. Kong, and her adopted daughter, Gia, who previously had a strong connection with Kong through sign language in Godzilla vs. Kong. And despite having that strong connection with Kong, is now no longer in Hollow Earth, no longer interacting with Kong, and is having this kind of crisis of she's the last of her people, the Iwi people who lived on Skull Island, and she feels out of place in the world. So she feels like she doesn't belong on the surface world. She doesn't really belong with Kong either. She just doesn't know where she should be because she has no other Iwi to interact with in the end. So she feels very isolated. So that's the very beginning of both films, which sounds similar in the sense of setting the stage for things, but then we progress deeper.
Well, the first story, the very beginning of -1 is incredibly moody. The soundtrack is very good. It's very scary. And the scenes with Godzilla are just edge of your seat, nail biting. It really grabs you. It's got a very strong mood, and it's like a mood of terror and apprehension and an anxiety feeling, which I could still very vividly remember sitting in that theater even now, several months later. So you contrast that with New Empire. It's more of a Saturday morning cartoon kind of tone, Yeah, it's just more lighthearted, basically. And yeah, you just don't get any of that human drama. It's like an amusement park ride, a good one. I'll admit it, a good one. You go to Universal Studios and you get a little 3-minute ride. Saturday morning cartoon versus edge of your seat drama with a monster in it is what I would compare them to.
What I think is important to recognize is despite the tonal differences, at this point in both films, the potential to be a good Godzilla film is there. We have the potential in both films of having a deeper characterization because we obviously have the Godzilla -1, the trauma of World War II, this family not of blood but of circumstance coming together. And then we have this similar drama being set up where we have a mother with an adopted daughter who is isolated from her culture, isolated from her heritage, and trying to make her way in the world. So on a base level, we have that potential to have really strong human drama in both of these movies at this stage. And then so far, the monster drama has been good. in the sense of not yet Godzilla, but a Godzillasaurus having a very good opening scene, establishing his dominance. A good opening scene with Kong adapting to Hollow Earth and Godzilla calling a new empire. And also a good opening scene of Godzilla establishing his dominance over another monster in Rome. So we start on pretty good footing in the sense of the potential for a good Godzilla movie. And then we kind of continue to move forward. So Godzilla Minus One spends the rest of the first act into the second act basically showing this family trying to rebuild their life in Tokyo. They meet with other members of the Japanese military who are now doing other things. The main male character gets a job sweeping mines that are left over from the war. He meets a professor character and a boat captain, and also a young go-getter who did not fight in the war. He was too young to fight in the war, but is still trying to make his way in Japanese society. So they're clearing out these mines. He's making money, able to build a new house for the woman he is with and the baby. And you can slowly see Tokyo slowly rebuilding during this period. And as that is happening, nuclear tests happen on the island where the Godzillasaurus was, which turns him into Godzilla. And we get these news reports that Godzilla is destroying American Navy ships and is slowly heading his way towards Japan. And then eventually, the intersection of Godzilla with the main characters is that the Japanese are trying to delay to get a heavy cruiser from World War II to come to Japan to help fight Godzilla, because the Americans don't want to risk a confrontation with Russia. So they're not going to help the Japanese deal with this problem. And this sets up a very poignant scene where Godzilla comes and basically destroys a nearby fishing boat that's working with them, and then starts chasing their boat. And the scene is very reminiscent of Jaws in the sense of Godzilla chasing this boat very closely, and they're throwing these mines to try and kill him. And the mines do a lot of damage to him, but he regenerates and keeps going. And then eventually the heavy cruiser shows up, attacks Godzilla, and Godzilla destroys the cruiser with his nuclear breath. And again, kind of establishes his dominance of territory. And another thing I'll point out during these things is there is some good comedy moments in here. Like before Godzilla shows up, there's this kind of cockiness of like, oh, we're going to kill this Godzilla and we're going to be famous. And then when he shows up and destroys their fishing boat, the main captain of the main fishing boat is like, yeah, we need to get out of here. Forget everything we had planned. Like, let's get out of here. And the reason I point that out is there is good comedy, as we will point out, in Godzilla Kong the New Empire. But I really like the balance of Godzilla Minus One, that it is a quote unquote serious movie. It is a very serious movie. There are very depressing moments that occur, but there's also this great comedy that's weaved in. I think that's important because you can have a serious movie and have good situational comedy in it.
The horror, the tension, the suspense, it's like you're building up something inside you emotionally, you know? You're building up, maybe you're even holding your breath. And then when you have the comedy, it's like a great release valve, you know? So it's almost kind of easier to laugh. So I always found that's kind of like the sweet and salty, you know, the peanut butter to the jelly. Yeah, Minus One does that really well.
So we get that. They get their first encounter with Godzilla. And then within that same time frame, Godzilla Kong the New Empire, we get this distress signal that comes out of a new threat that gets Godzilla riled up to where he's going to go fight some other titans to get himself powered up. It sends this weird telepathic signal to Gia, again, the character who is the last of the Iwi and has a connection with Kong. So she starts having these weird visions, and her adopted mother, Dr. Andrews, is very concerned about this. And I think this is where we start seeing the peeling of like, how are these characters going to be used between Godzilla Minus One and Godzilla Kong the New Empire. And in Godzilla Kong, we see this opportunity. We see this opportunity of really focusing more on this relationship between Dr. Andrews and Gia, and seeing like this relationship between adopted mother, adopted daughter, and that Gia is definitely really suffering from these visions, and Dr. Andrews wants to find a solution to it. But instead of this really bringing Dr. Andrews and Gia together, it's more used as a plot device to get Dr. Andrews to seek out other characters' help to then go to Hollow Earth. And it's like, yes, that is somewhat of a natural progression, but I feel like compared to Godzilla minus one, it's more of it's pushing the plot forward rather than pulling these characters together, because Gia is kept out of Hollow Earth for a while simply because Dr. Andrews is like, she makes this statement in sign language saying, oh, it's too dangerous for you to go to Hollow Earth, except that she spent the entire last movie in Hollow Earth and she was a lot younger. And again, I think that's just a missed opportunity in the end. They do eventually bring her down there, but I just think that's a missed opportunity to be like, why are you trying to put these barriers up when it's like organically, you should just let this happen and organically allow these two characters to spend some more time together.
Minus one, it sounds like a lot of care was taken for the emotional beats to flow correctly. Whereas I can't get in the mind of the screenwriters, but it sounds like the New Empire, it's like, how do we get this thing moving forward? We just got to get this boulder rolling down the hill so the movie can happen.
Yeah, because I think like editing and plot wise for New Empire, like when Gia's having these visions, they don't need to go through, in my opinion, all this other rigmarole of involving other characters and so forth. It needs to be like, you're having these visions, we're getting seismic readings from the Hollow Earth, let's just go to the Hollow Earth. But I think that's better editing, it's a cleaner script. And if we don't involve other characters like the kaiju conspiracy theorist, which I think is a fine character, I just question his need in this film because I just don't think he adds a lot to Godzilla, Kong, and New Empire. I think if you removed him, that gives you more emotional space for Dr. Andrews and Gia to spend more time together, which again, they do end up spending a good amount of time together in Hollow Earth, and Gia plays an important plot role, but I think it becomes more organic and allows for more emotional weight of those emotional scenes between the two of them. But again, I think that's lost because they want to involve these other characters for reasons I don't completely understand, which dilutes, I think, what is the first strong relationship that they could have emphasized. So they do eventually go down to Hollow Earth. And while they are doing that, Godzilla continues to power up, fighting different monsters. Kong is ambushed by members of his own race that he didn't know still existed, a baby Kong named Suko, and some these almost warrior undead looking Kongs, almost like zombie looking Kongs. Though they're not zombies, they're just kind of malnourished. They attack him and they mug him. And this eventually drives Kong to try to figure out where do these apes come from and like what is going on here. Because he thought he was the last of his kind, and now clearly he isn't. You know, there are other Kongs in existence. So he goes to explore that. That then introduces him to the main villain of the film, which is the Scar King, who is another member of the Kong species who previously was trying to conquer the world, which is explained deeper in the plot, but they end up duking it out. Scar King has another Titan named Shimo who has the power to freeze things, basically freezes Kong's right hand, heavily damaging it, and basically allowing Kong with his damaged hand to escape while being chased by his minions. I will mention leading into him meeting the Scar King, he does have some emotional moments with Suko, the baby Kong, who initially is very treacherous to him and tries to get him killed twice. Kong shows great love and forgiveness for him, and slowly they start building a relationship, which I think is a good emotional connection in this movie, though I think it is questionable at times. And the reason I say questionable is there are moments when Suko is trying to get Kong killed, when if he really just wants to get him killed and leave, he could just leave. There's a scene where he leads him to a lake where he knows there's some kind of sea serpent in the lake and effectively gets the sea serpent to attack Kong. He could have just left and hightailed it to Scar King at that point, but he didn't. And I think that's kind of this forced plot of like, yes, we want to kind of build this connection between Kong and Suko, but I feel it's very forced because Suko could have just gone to the Scar King and then Kong would have never met the Scar King, as he wouldn't know where to find him. So I feel like that was kind of a plot convenience of like, rather than organically allowing the two of them to kind of spend time together, etc., they basically make Zuko make these highly questionable decisions to stay with Kong, even though he could have just hightailed it back home without him. And again, it's like at this moment, we haven't had those issues with Godzilla minus one. Like we've had very organic connections and things are just kind of naturally coming together. We're not forcing these things to happen in the end. So those things happen. And then we lead more into kind of the latter half of the second act of both movies. So in Godzilla minus one, the main female character decides she wants to be more independent, get a job on her own. She gets a job in the Ginza district of Tokyo, which is flourishing after the war. So she's going out there with her new job and spending time away from the main male character and the baby. And during this period, Godzilla shows up and attacks Tokyo for the first time, and attacks specifically the Ginza district where she's working. So this is the first time in this movie that Godzilla is fully out of the water and fully attacking a city. So it's a very big moment where he's smashing buildings, destroying a lot of historic areas within that district. He recreates a classic scene from the 1954 Godzilla where he picks up a train with the main character in his mouth, and she is able to survive. It's just paying homage again to the original 1954 Godzilla. And it is very menacing. Like you just feel this powerlessness in the people, that they have nothing to really fight against Godzilla with. They do eventually use some tanks to attack him. And then he unleashes his atomic breath, which is by far the most powerful version we've seen in any version of Godzilla, because it literally nukes the city and recreates in Tokyo what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is a very emotionally poignant movie for the Japanese people, because they are, as of now, writing this review, in comparison, the only country on Earth that has suffered a nuclear attack during war. And they recreated it very nicely in the sense that you have the explosion, you have the hurricane force winds afterwards, you have the black rain, which is very brief but poignant, because the black rain represents all the debris, whether it be the buildings or the human remains of people who were instantly vaporized by the explosion, now raining back down, which was something that was very traumatizing to the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In that moment, the main female character sacrifices herself to save the male character from the blast. So he is a man that has lost his family in the war, lost his perceived honor because he survived as a kamikaze pilot, and now he has lost his main love interest from Godzilla. So he's lost everything from the war and Godzilla, and he is at an emotional low point in the film. He now has his baby who is orphaned that he has to take care of. And you can just see it in this scene where they're doing a funeral service for the main female character, where you can just see him mentally breaking down. Like I think any human being would in a situation where you're just like, you've hit rock bottom, and you can see his PTSD kicking in, etc. And he just doesn't know what to do. And the main scientist character comes up to him and is like, look, I know you've lost a lot, and Godzilla ravaged a good portion of Tokyo, but we have a plan to deal with Godzilla. And you can just see this like little bit of hope enter his mind, because in this rock bottom state, he's hyper focused on wanting to do something against Godzilla, though clearly doesn't know what he can do. So now all of a sudden you see this glimmer of hope in him that maybe he can get some payback for what's going on.
Because I'm trying to get my grips around, like, what are the fine details that separate these plots and emotions? And something that occurred to me is that there's a evolution of despair in -1. A problem is presented to the protagonist, and then another problem is presented on top of that one, and the first one's still there, and then another one is presented. You know, it's like an evolution of this journey, which just keeps you engaged. And I think that's part of why -1 is more compelling. That's what I'm catching.
Yes, and the other thing is that there's just a lot more time spent on the human characters in -1. Or there's just a lot more time for them to interact with each other and develop. Whereas in that same time frame of Godzilla Kong, there's a lot more time spent on Godzilla and Kong, so the human element feels very rushed. But I think that's purposefully done. Like, I think the script is purposefully not giving the humans a lot of time to work. But you feel that. You feel that that hurts the plot significantly because the human part doesn't have enough time to breathe. It has opportunities like Godzilla -1 to be deeper, but they don't give it the time to do so.
I mean, like, I feel like the most characterization is given to Kong in New Empire, honestly. Yeah, and he doesn't even have any speaking dialogue, but I mean, his name is in the title, so that makes sense. And I wonder if it's because they don't have faith in them, because like they don't have faith in those actors or that storyline, so they don't linger on it that much. Because obviously, I think in -1 they knew they had a strong story. They knew they had good actors who could perform it, and so yeah, I don't know. Like those human scenes are staged so well. Like when you think about the lighting, the music, there was so much care put into those human scenes that I think just wasn't there for New Empire.
I don't think they had faith in it, or they just didn't. Whether it was faith or just desire, that it was needed in the end. Just sad because other MonsterVerse films have. Godzilla 2014, Kong Skull Island did a very good job of giving the humans time to work. Certainly 2014 Godzilla, you could make arguments that are very valid that the scripts had flaws, but at least the humans were more fleshed out in that movie than, at least at this point, where we are in Empire. And certainly Kong Skull Island had very, very well fleshed out characters, very, very good purpose and so forth, and all that is going on too.
I know one of the big things that makes these kaiju films good is when you're commenting on a real world issue, real problem. Now, did you notice that did Godzilla 2014 or Kong Skull Island, did they do that in those films?
To a degree. With Godzilla 2014, I think the biggest thing there was talking about natural order and balance and the idea that humanity is a part of the natural order, but we are not in control of everything. Dr. Serizawa in 2014 has a very poignant statement. He goes, mankind in its arrogance thinks it controls the laws of nature, but he never has and he never will. And we see that with climate change and so forth, right? Is the idea that we can influence things, but like we can't control this. We can't stop earthquakes. We can, in fact, make them worse with climate change. And I think that was a lot of what that movie was trying to hit on, was this idea that we can just solve problems by exerting our will in the natural order, whereas allowing Godzilla in that movie, who is part of the natural order, deal with the Mutos, that's actually the better way to do things, is to say, we don't always need to intervene. Like Mother Nature can handle some things on her own, as she always has before we ever existed. I think that was the theme of 2014. Kong Skull Island was very much so talking about America's involvement in the Vietnam War. It takes place at the end of the Vietnam War, with the main military unit in that movie getting sent home. And Samuel Jackson's character is actually very happy to get this mission and go to Skull Island because he doesn't want to go back home. He is of the opinion that America has not lost the Vietnam War, as he puts it, but abandoned it. That he believes all of his time spent in Vietnam is now being wasted because they just won't double down on the, which of course we know in modern times, we weren't going to win the Vietnam, period. Like that was a war that we were going to lose. What Samuel Jackson's character in that movie expresses very heavily was something that was believed by a lot of Vietnam vets at the time, was that they felt betrayed by the American government, the American people, to say, we fought and we died in this godforsaken jungle in Vietnam, and we could have won if you just kept supporting us, basically. And we see that play out on Skull Island because as they get there and they encounter Kong, and Kong kills a lot of them because he's defending his territory, because they're literally dropping seismic bombs all over his island, pissing him off, that Samuel Jackson becomes hyper-focused on needing to kill King Kong at all costs, even at the cost of his own men's lives, even at the cost of them getting off that island. As he says very poignantly at one point in the film, he goes, I know an enemy when I see it, and I'm not going to cut and run from this one. And basically making a veiled reference to cutting and running in Vietnam.
Mm.
And one of the soldiers under him, who unfortunately dies in the film, he makes a very important statement where he's like, "Yeah, we were going to a Vietnam village one day, and this gun that I have in my hand here, I got it from a Viet Cong member, and he was 50 years old." And he told me when we captured him, he goes, he didn't even know what a gun was until the Americans showed up. And he goes, what I learned from him was that sometimes an enemy doesn't exist until you make it. Meaning that this man would never have fought in a war if America wasn't there fighting the war in Vietnam, basically. And that alludes here that Samuel L. Jackson's character is making Kong an enemy, where he was not an enemy before. So there's a huge amount of deep philosophy of the American psyche of the Vietnam War, and that's also represented by the different characters. You have a war photographer who's very anti-war. You have a former British SAS officer who he has seen the baddest parts of war and is more neutral on Vietnam. So you get all these different perspectives, both American and outside of America, on the Vietnam War. And that's why that movie is so good. That's why it's the peak of the MonsterVerse series, because it accomplishes the same thing that the best Godzilla movies do. You have compelling plots, you have great characters, and as you pointed out, Biologist Wild Trees it is a commentary on something. It is a commentary on something that is important. I don't think Kong Skull Island was commenting on modern American politics, but it was heavily commenting on the Vietnam War, which is still a hot topic today.
And there's definitely mistakes that were done in that war that could easily be repeated in the future. Yeah.
Exactly. And in case there are any Vietnam vets listening to this, your service was not in vain in Vietnam, but I firmly believe with our modern knowledge of that war, is America did you a disservice by asking you to fight a war that you were not well equipped to win. So your service was not in vain. I don't think you failed the country or you failed anyone. I think America failed you by sending you to a fight that you were not well equipped to win. Coming back to these two movies, so we have this opportunity with the human characters in Godzilla Kong going to the Hollow Earth and searching for the signal. They come across a lost Iwi civilization, so the same civilization that Gia's character is from. This is a big deal because now all of a sudden she's not alone anymore. There's others of her kind, right? He is able to interact with them and listen to them, and they provide more backstory. They provide this backstory that a long time ago, the Scar King tried to conquer the Earth with Shimo, and actually helped contribute to the first ice age that humanity dealt with. And in him trying to do that, it was Godzilla or Godzilla's kind. They're a little vague on that, if it's one Godzilla or the species Godzilla fights against him. It basically traps him in a deeper section of Hollow Earth, just traps him in rubble. That happens. They link that Mothra, who showed up previously in the series, is actually a protector of the Iwi, which is really weird because she did not protect the Iwi at all earlier in the series. So it seems to be this weird kind of retcon. And that Gia is going to bring Mothra back, that they have a prophecy of a Iwi member from Skull Island coming back to the Hollow Earth to bring Mothra back, which is getting a little weird. That's happening. Now I'll point out something here because, again, this is where I think a missed opportunity happened plot-wise. So we mentioned that you have Gia, who is the last of her kind, who now discovers the Iwi civilization in Hollow Earth, just as we have Kong, who thought he was the last of his kind, who also discovers other Kongs in Hollow Earth. You see the connection, very easy connection. Do they do anything with this in the movie, Biologist Wild Trees?
No.
To me, that's one of the big things. It's like they have these opportunities. It's not that they don't have these opportunities to be deep like Godzilla -1. They do have these opportunities, but they choose not to. Why do they choose not to? I don't know. But the way it plays out in the film is it's hard for them to do so because they don't give the humans enough time. Because I think they spend too much time doing things with the Titans that honestly, through better editing, they don't have to do in the end. The two things I would point out is a lot of people who thoroughly enjoy Godzilla Kong, A New Empire, say they really love the monster fighting. Well, I would argue two of the monster fights Godzilla has are two really unnecessary fights. His fight with Scalia in Rome and his fight with Tiamat in the Arctic, because they're so short and not really that impactful to the plot at all. So I would argue you could edit those out, give some more time to make these kind of comparisons between Kong and Gia, who already have a strong connection from Godzilla versus Kong, that through some simple editing, we can go deeper into that connection. And that would very heavily mimic some of what is going on in Godzilla -1, in the sense of the trauma that the main characters are experiencing from post-war Japan, etc., and being victims of Godzilla's attack, just as Godzilla himself is a victim of an atomic bombing and trying to find his place in a world that is not welcoming to him. And as we go deeper into this, that's what I see a lot of the big difference here is not that Godzilla Kong: A New Empire can't be deeper. It's just they actively choose not to be. They just decide for whatever reason, we're not going to explore any of these things that we could have explored in the end. So they go deeper with this, deeper into the Iwa civilization of saying they have this anti-gravity technology and they use crystals to power it, and that's how they're able to send their telepathic signal to Gia to get her down there. And while all that is going on, Kong comes back injured with his injured hand, and they end up healing his hand magically with some green juice and give him an upgraded hand, mechanical hand, power fist, that he will inevitably need to help fight the Scar King later. That is a very weird plot moment because the healing juice to heal his frostbitten hand just sounds like a convenient plot device. Because if that really exists, do they really need to power him up with a power fist? Because they could just be like, hey, you got beat up in a fight. Let's just inject you with this and get you back on the field. It just seems like a very poorly thought out plot device just to get Kong back out there. And then they get him up to the surface because they realize they need Godzilla in order to fight the Scar King and hopefully win this war. And Kong and Godzilla fight each other and have a pretty entertaining fight, I will say. I don't know plot-wise entirely necessary because there are some convenient ways Kong could have just lured Godzilla to the Hollow Earth. But again, I think they just wanted to have a rematch. And while that is happening, the human characters with Gia magically bring Mothra back. She literally walks to the top of a pyramid, extends her hand, and Mothra appears. And yes, it makes that little sense, folks. If you haven't watched the review for the movie, I don't know. I don't know. It's just like, we need Mothra in this film.
The rumors are that there was a different flying kaiju that was going to do the role of Mothra, and it didn't test well in test screenings, so they're like, well, let's just go with the tried and true flying monster Mothra, fan favorite. And I think in that quick switcheroo, they probably left out some details that made things make more sense.
And that's another editing thing where I don't really think they needed to do that. I think they could have excluded a flying kaiju or Mothra as a whole. And with that time, they could have, again, reignited the connection between Gia and Kong. And I think Gia could have given Kong ideas or ways in which to convince Godzilla to help them fight the Scar King rather than needing Mothra to do it in the end. And the reason I point that out is because they didn't need Mothra to convince King Kong and Godzilla to fight Mechagodzilla, did they? No, they didn't.
Right.
So it's like, you didn't need him in the last film to get them to team up. Why do you need her in this film? This goes back to what we talked about. The best of these movies, they intersect the human and the kaiju storylines. And I feel like that's a strong missed intersection to say, let's use Gia to help Kong to work with Godzilla. Like, I think that is a natural thing they could have done with this, which would have greatly elevated this film and greatly cut out on all this other random stuff that they're having to do to force the plot to move forward. And I say this with the best intentions, For anyone watching this who is like, oh, Dr. Blalock's being too hard on Godzilla Kong, the reason I'm being hard is I think with better writing and so forth, this could have easily been a better film. I don't think they needed to throw this entire film out to make it a better Godzilla or King Kong movie. I think with some very reasonable adjustments to the plot and so forth, and with the budget that they have, they could have done so much more. Do you agree, Biologist Wild Trees?